We're here with Shem Phillips of Garphill Games to talk about replayability. I mean, I guess a big thing for us is, how do you go about designing and, I guess, looking at building series? Because that's something really interesting that you do. Is a lot of your games seem to be series of 3 games or so, but they're so different.
Yeah, so the first trilogy was very much kind of accidental. We just kind of designed it as I was doing it. So the first game I put out Shipwrights, I had no ambition of making a trilogy. I just kind of fell into it. And then for the second trilogy, the West Kingdom, that's when Sam McDonald came on board. So we had a bit more structure, kind of a bit more of a plan happening. And now that we're working on the South trilogy, we've very much kind of sort of written out the whole story, know what we're doing, much more of a plan. So we kind of figure it out as we go usually, but finally we're starting to get a bit more ahead of ourselves, more planned. But yeah, it's kind of a challenge to always make each game unique, but yet still feel like they belong together as a set. So, yeah.
Okay.
The one thing I was looking at least in the Architects trilogy, when I look on BGG, I see it some people will say the game plays better at 4 and then 2. Is that part of the design when you're going in? You're going to develop it to maybe it is for more of this target audience than the other ones, or how's that work?
Just as a general rule for our trilogies, we want them most of them, I guess, to always be 1 to 4 players as a bare minimum. But then some games just want to they suit higher player counts. So Architects definitely suits a higher player count. So if we were to cap that at 4, I think we'd kind of be missing something in the box for that one. So that's why it went to 5. We'd already tested the game at 6 early on. We knew it worked at 6. So it's just, games want to be what they want to be. We don't want to force them into a certain mold that kind of ruins them or makes the experience worse. So, but yeah, it's a general thing. Most of our games should be 1 to 4. But we can expand them if we feel like they can support that higher player count without kind of making the game drag on too long or whatever it might be. Yeah.
So one really cool thing you just mentioned was that you kind of write the story or think the story out. So do you come up with your theme and kind of the story background before you build the mechanics to go with it, or do you kind of do them simultaneously?
Kind of simultaneously. We have the setting kind of figured out, so we know we're in West Francia. That much is decided at least. And then we might have a general kind of story, the first game's about building up, so I guess the second game's about kind of defending what you've built. That's kind of a very, very loose concept. And then we dive into mechanisms, so figuring out what the game's going to be about and how the thing is going to work and connect. And then once we kind of have that kind of working, we go back to theme and think more deeply about what is the actual story, what is happening, who are you as players, that kind of stuff. And that helps to then inform the mechanisms even further to kind of make them knit together more. Yeah. So it's kind of back and forward, making sure they all kind of mesh.
That's awesome. And it makes the theme really kind of built into the game rather than those so-called painted on themes, we'll say.
Yeah, that's the hope, at least.
So, one thing that I find really interesting, at least in Paladins, there's so many different variable parts. So depending on, whether you attack them or whether you recruit them, depending on what kind of resources or the color of meeples you have will depend on what actions you can do. Yet you have very kindly given the action where you can get the purple wild meeple, which I'm not going to lie, is my favorite meeple in the entire game, because I can't manage my meeples. But is that something that you kind of plan when you're building, to have lots of variety and kind of different games every time you set up based on the cards that come out?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for replayability is the decisions that the players will make in the game. So that's why high conflict games are very replayable, even say chess, because the players have so much agency, so they can drive how the game's going to feel. And I think Euro games often lack that interaction, obviously. So we try and give them variability in some other way, but that variability should basically encourage different play styles. That's kind of what we aim to do. So that's through like variable player powers or the various townsfolk that give different benefits. So as you're playing, you might be kind of pushed down a certain path, and then your decisions are encouraged to kind of take this path more than another one. That's going to make the game feel different from the last time you played. So that's kind of what we're aiming to do with those various powers and different options, the multi-use cards that you mentioned, that kind of stuff. So really want to encourage the players to make the game feel different, if that makes sense.
No, for sure. Your newest design, at least that was coming out to market here, Hadrian's Wall, has a roll and write style component to it. How did you come about bringing that into your series of games?
So yeah, that was, we had the big like burst of roll and writes obviously in the last couple of years.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to jump on that train. I was like, no, let's let someone else do it. We won't do that. And then my friend Bobby shows me this game that he designed. I was like, well, that's a fantastic game. So I kind of have to design it now. I didn't want to do a roll and write, but we're doing a roll and write. But I've known Bobby for probably 4 or 5 years. And he's designed tons of different games that we play test each other's games quite a bit. And when he showed me that game, I just knew this is a Garphill Games kind of game. It has a very Paladins kind of feel to it with the combos. So I was like, well, it's a friend of mine. He's made a game that fits our brand, so I'm going to publish it. And we just chose to kind of put it in a similar aesthetic to Raiders of Scythia, and kind of follow on that line a bit. Yeah, it's really a lot of fun, that game.
So is that game going to become a trilogy, or is that a kind of standalone at this point?
Not a trilogy.
Okay.
We don't want to like kind of box them in. So those games will be very different, but they will have a similar look.
Okay.
The third game we have planned for that kind of line, I guess, is a solo campaign game. So very different. Yeah. So we'll see.
Will the box style stay the same? At least sometimes we notice we talk about box styles and just walls, and people love to collect things that look very similar.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So the South trilogy will be like a more of a yellowish kind of desert tone. So look the same graphic design style as you've seen in the North and the South, North and the West. And then for like the games like Scythia and Hadrian's Wall, they'll probably all have similar kind of tones with the kind of banner for a scrolling title and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
And the one thing we find with your games and when we see them all over Instagram is the sheer number of components you guys manage to fit in a compact box at a reasonable price. Is that a goal of Garphill Games that you want, we like to maximize shelf space, so we appreciate it, but is that a goal of yours when you're setting out?
I got given that box size when I was doing a really old game of mine. The manufacturer just recommended this box will fit what you want to put in the game, so I kind of stuck with it. And then for shipwrights, I was like, I guess I'll use that same box template because I've got it on file. And I've just stuck with it. And our games are getting kind of almost too big for them now, especially Paladins. So I think in the future, if we need a game like Paladins to fit a game, we'll probably make that slightly deeper, but keep that same square. But yeah, it's definitely been a challenge. And it's always a thing we're constantly thinking about, like, will it fit in the box? Because we just kind of want to add more depth and more cards and more things. Without going to a bigger box size, hopefully.
That's actually amazing. I was not expecting that answer. So you've been designing games, I think, since around 2009. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yep.
So how has your kind of design developed in the way that you design a game in the terms of kind of creating those player interactions that you do now?
So the first 6 years was basically me just like experimenting, making little card games and various kind of even family games, and kind of figuring out how to design what I like in games and that kind of stuff. I started designing before I even knew about modern tabletop board games, so I was kind of learning about new games as I was making games. So it's kind of weird, but I guess in those first 6 years it was very much going like, I quite like card games or multi-use card games. Like I enjoy set collection, kind of finding things I liked to add into games. And then the North Sea was probably still me figuring out what I like. Obviously Raiders was the one that stood out for most people, and that's kind of the game that resonated the most. And then so going into Architects with that in mind was very much kind of like we kind of know what we like. And then with Sam coming on board, he has very similar tastes. He prefers more engine building, more interaction. I enjoy more like set collection and multi-use cards and kind of I guess more the figuring out a puzzle, that kind of abstract kind of nature of the game. So we kind of found this niche of like, this is what we both like together. So that's why I think the West Kingdom seems far more like designed as a set, because we kind of know what we like now. Whereas all the games before that were like me figuring out what I like to do in games. Yeah.
Thinking ahead to your current trilogy that you're doing and going ahead to a solo game. If I recall back, I'm just going through my memory, you always haven't had like a solo. If I go back to like the Raiders, I don't think that was a solo to begin with. They didn't have a solo option. How would you say that the growth of solo gaming has kind of affected what you're doing in terms of putting that into a box, or even now making just a pure solo game?
Yeah, so our first solo ever was for Explorers. I think at that point, maybe I'd played a solo game, 1 or 2 maybe. So it was on my mind, I guess. And it seemed quite easy for that one to implement, because it was just like you draw 3 tiles. I think you draw 2 tiles, you place 1 and carry on. So it's like a timer rather than you're playing an opponent. And then when Sam came on board with Architects, I think he wanted to make a solo bot for it. I think it was, from memory, the main kind of driving behind it was so that he could use it to test the game more, rather than always organizing playtests. He could just test the game solo. So he made the first version of that, and I really liked it. And I was like, well, I could probably do something similar like that for Raiders. So I went back and made the solo pack for Raiders. And now moving forward, we just think, well, if you can make a game solo, why not? It's usually going to be like 20 or 30 cards at most, maybe a player board, and it's really useful from a design point of view for testing, because you can play, like, I can play 6 games of Architects solo in like 3 or 4 hours and just smash them out and get the balance right. You can play AI versus AI and see how they kind of balance out together and stuff. So it's just really useful. It makes our design process a lot faster as well.
So when you're making just a purely solo game, does that just take on like that extra little bit more, or how does that work?
Yeah, so for that one, it's funny, I designed it as a solo, but it's kind of plays like a co-op, I guess. You don't score points, you just either win or you lose. But with that one, I started working on it. I was like, this is good. It's like crunchy, it's good decisions and lots of tension. And then we were at a design meetup, and for whatever reason, the idea of making a campaign or a legacy style game kind of popped in. Something again that I wasn't wanting to touch. I was like, everyone else can do legacy and do their roll and rights. I won't touch that stuff. But I got sucked into it. So yeah, that's been really interesting, because I've never done that kind of thing before, of like kind of trying to create a campaign. And this one's going to be like a non-linear, non-destructive campaign that you can replay. So
okay,
it's going to be similar to how the legacy games for Pandemic work. It's kind of it could be this many games, or 10 to 20 games or whatever. But at some point it will end and you'll have a final story and that kind of stuff. So it's been interesting. I'm not a storyteller. I'm not a big narrative kind of person, as much as I enjoy as a good story. So I'm bringing on a friend of mine to kind of do all the story elements and that kind of stuff. But it's been easy to develop because it's just solo. So, but yeah, no, it's a lot of fun.
Oh, sounds cool.
You can design a game if you play enough games, but I have to say, it's the stories and how all the mechanisms work together. It's amazing the amount of research people put into the development of a good story.
Yeah. Well, just picking up on that point, that's an interesting point. One thing I do find with board games, more so than almost any other hobby, there's very few people that play golf and say, I could be a professional golfer. People that drive cars, I could drive professionally. But I would say a good chunk of board gamers, at least that we're around, people say, I can design a game. But no, I don't think that's the case. I don't know if you have any comment on that, or just...
Yeah, for sure. I think I agree. There's like a lot of people who play a game and think, I could make a game. And they probably could. And maybe they could do 1 or 2, or maybe they can get going, but it's a lot of work. And even after my very first game I made, which is a real simple family game, like for the next 5 years, I'd be like, can I make another one? And then I'd make another one, and can I make another one? And just doubting yourself constantly, because it's kind of like with anything creative, you hope that the ideas will come. I think writing apparently is very similar. You just hope that you'll get an inspiration. But with board games, I think why I like it is that there's this tangible mathematic kind of thing behind it, where you can actually just forget about the creativity for a while and just crunch the numbers and test it and play it over and over and tweak stuff. But it's like a 6 to 9 month process for us of from like first initial idea to like fully finished kind of design. So it's a big process, lots of testing, and it's the experience you have from design that makes better games. So when if we find an issue in a game that we want to fix, we've got all this experience of like knowing what does work and doesn't work in various games we've played and designed that we can pull on. Whereas if it's your first game, you're kind of like, oh, what could I do? I don't know. There's you don't know the solutions and things like that. So, yeah.
What's an interesting thing is, as you've mentioned how you've kind of gotten into, okay, there's maybe a roll and write, here's a legacy style game. I'm not going to name any other designers, but there's certain designers you play and it feels like some of the other stuff you've played before with maybe a little bit of a switch here and there. Your games are different and they sound like they're going to become a little bit more different as you go. Do you make a conscious effort to kind of change up?
Yeah, as a designer, I'm much more in that camp of like, I want to make different games. So like, I'm trying to think of the names as well. I've forgotten the names, but there's some designers who will like just make completely different games constantly. And then you've got other designers that focus on kind of one game or two games and then like recreate them and make them hone them, make them better and better and better. So it's kind of two camps, I guess. I think I fall more in the make new games camp, but as a publisher, I'm in this weird camp of like make the games feel similar and look similar. So kind of somewhere in the middle is where we can land in our products. But as a designer, I want to make different stuff. But yeah.
Will you ever think of, just following along with that point, maybe making a trilogy but stretching it out over like 6, 7, 8 years and then start sneaking some games in between it? Because you seem to be more like linear. Here's your 3 and then here's your 3, here's your 3.
I don't think I have the patience to wait. We've already designed like the first 2 games in the South, and we already want to like release them now. But knowing they're coming out in like 2 or 3 years, it's agonizing for us because we want people to play them and enjoy them. So, yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah. And the other thing that's interesting about your games are they're kind of different themes. Like right now, there seems to be a big wave of, let's say, food games and beverage games and whatnot, but your games all seem to be like a unique story in each one. Is that a conscious decision to kind of do your own thing?
I guess we kind of locked ourselves into medieval for the next like 6 years at least. So we're not really following trends, I suppose, on themes. But yeah, no, I get that. I love just like swords and shields, medieval, Dark Ages, or even like classics. So I love playing in that kind of that space with swords and, like combat and all sorts of stuff. But I guess that's what I like. I'm not really probably going to design a game about making cupcakes. That's just probably not me. But I would play that game and probably enjoy it. But, you kind of got to lean to your strengths and know that medieval is kind of where I sit. I love that kind of space. So, yeah.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Mm-hmm. If you know it, you're going to design a more thorough game rather than a superficial one.
Yeah, but I've done like Noctiluca, which was C-Man published a couple of years ago, which was like a dice game about collecting little Noctiluca inside the water. So it's very light, fluffy, airy kind of game. I've done Shelfie Stacker, which comes out this year, which is like about how to fill your board game shelf. So it's very, very abstract and very meta. Yeah.
She is all about that game and is super, super excited about that game.
Nice. Yeah, so it's still fun to explore different themes, but yeah, for Garphill Games at least, we're kind of locked into what we're doing now, I guess.
So do you design a lot of games for other publishers, or just kind of if it's a totally different style than your games? Is that the only time you publish?
Basically, yeah. So if I happen to design some kind of lighter game or abstract game that won't fit our brand, then I'll try and pitch it to someone else.
Okay.
Yeah. Because in the past, I would just basically publish everything that I designed and got this big mishmash of different types of games.
Yeah.
Whereas you kind of now, if you get a Garphill Games game, you should know kind of what you're in for. Like a medium weight Euro style game that might take up to 2 hours, that kind of thing. Yeah.
No, it makes perfect sense because I know people that will buy just, certain brand puts out X game, they know what they're getting. So it just helps the purchase decision.
Thank you, Shem, for talking to us about your design process and Garphill Games.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.